of the West Sacramento Planning Commission. I'd like to start this evening with the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Doherty, would you lead us this evening?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Tonight's agenda is available on the counter along with request to speak cards. A reminder to everyone that request to speak cards should be completed and turned into the clerk prior to the completion of any staff presentation. For those speakers wishing to speak on items not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of this commission, please write the item number on your card. All speakers will be limited to 3 minutes. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and televised, so all speakers, in order to be recognized, must be called on by the chair and come forward to the microphone. Speaking in public may cause some individuals to be uncomfortable, so everyone is asked to be professional and respectful at all times. And tonight we will start the agenda with the General Administration Function, Part 1, presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of the Commission. I do have one request to speak on an item not on the agenda this evening by Mr. Owen Smith. So you may come up to the microphone, sir.
Thank you.
You just state your name for the record. And
My name is Owen Smith. Is there any other information you need?
that's it.
I just wanted to take a couple of minutes of the Commission's time because I've been watching all the really great infrastructure work going on in Broderick, and I live in an area that's just outside that, but that's, I think, is going to become increasingly important as the plans and construction of the new I Street Bridge come to fruition. The area I'm talking about is Sacramento Avenue corridor between 6th and 8th Street. And we have a number of issues there, and I've been in conversations with engineering and public works and code enforcement about some of them individually, but I'd like to bring it to the Commission's attention to kind of get maybe a bigger picture idea. The first big problem that exists there is just the curve of the street itself and the lack of visibility. I live on that section, and I've seen, I can't even tell you how many accidents and near accidents I've seen. At one time, there was a speed limit sign in front of my house. It was taken out in a collision several years ago and never replaced. I've seen trees run into, I've seen cars wrecked. There's a lot of traffic there, and that's just going to increase with the new bridge and the development in the rail yards. The second problem, which is related, is the complete lack of bicycle lanes, sidewalks, any kind of pedestrian and non-vehicular traffic. I don't need to elaborate on that. I'm sure you've all seen it. The third issue we have there, which is literally a little more underground, is the lack of sewer mains along that stretch. My sewer line actually goes out in back of my house along Sacramento Avenue. There's 170 feet of 50-year-old Orangeburg that comes out on California Street. My neighbor's in the same situation. Fortunately, my house is probably close enough to the main on Sacramento so that I could connect to it. I'm waiting for some information from engineering, but that's what it looks like. Other lots along that area, they're hundreds of feet away, literally, from any sewer main. So I don't know what the solution to all these is. I don't know what the visibility of this issue is to the Commission or the rest of the city, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
At this point in time, I do not have any other requests to speak for items not on the agenda. So we will move to correspondence and staff communications from the Planning Commission Secretary, Mr. Tilley.
Yes, thank you, Chair Sternfels. One item to note, I've heard from a few of you regarding the APA conference that's coming up in October in San Diego. We all usually encourage, commissioners to try to attend that. And so, I do have some funds in my training budget to help defray some of those costs. But before I, commit those to any one individual, I would like to, know if, who amongst any of you would be, interested in attending that. And that's something we can communicate with offline. But if those people that are interested in going to that, I don't recall the dates exactly, but I know it's in October, please communicate with me offline as soon as you can, is when you know that you're, would be seriously interested in attending that. Otherwise, that concludes staff communications at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Tilley. We'll then move to disclosure of ex parte communications. At this point in time, planning commissioners should disclose any communications they've had on the agenda items. I'll start to my left with Commissioner Liebig. None. Commissioner Harrison.
None.
Commissioner Vu.
No communications.
Commissioner Austin.
None to report.
Same here, none to report. Thank you very much, everyone. With that, we'll move to the consent agenda. Tonight, we have 3 items on the consent agenda. Item number 1 is approval of the minutes from the June 21st meeting. Item number 2 is a continued public hearing where staff is actually recommending to further continue the item regarding the plan development permit for the Rivers 2 apartment. So staff's recommendation here is a further continuance of this item, and hence why it's on the consent agenda this evening. And item 3, a public hearing regarding Olawu Homes Sites 1 tentative subdivision map 5132. Because there's a public hearing at the right time, I will open the public hearing briefly, although I do not have any current requests to speak on any items on the consent agenda.
Yeah, I would like to pull item 3, mostly just because I'd like a little more information and also because it's a public hearing, but I'm willing to keep 1 and 2, I am willing to keep 1 and 2 on the consent agenda.
So Ms. Austin, are you asking to pull it for discussion or for staff presentation or for both?
Both would be great. If there is a staff presentation prepared, I'm happy to hear it.
So what I would like to do is, unless you're inclined to pull it completely off the consent agenda, we can have a staff presentation and answer questions and still vote on the consent agenda.
Sure, that'd be fine.
Very well. I think unless anyone has anything they'd like to discuss or request on any of the other items.
Yes, for item number 2, I know we're continuing, I don't have a problem with it, but I think it was about 2 hearings ago, the applicant stated that he was relying on some data, and he made some representations during the hearing, and I had requested that data, but it still has not been forwarded to me. So hopefully that will happen before we entertain item number 2 publicly again.
Okay, hearing no other requests to pull items for discussion, Ms. Allen, do you mind doing a presentation on item 3?
Of course. Good evening, Chair Sternfels and members of the commission. Item number 3 is a request for a tentative subdivision map. The project would create 6 lots from one lot that's a little over 32 acres in size. The project is located in the agriculture zone where the minimum lot size is 5 acres, and this project, all the lots do meet the size requirement. It has a private road that runs through the project. The lots would be all on well and septic systems. The applicant has preemptively talked with Environmental Health, who has given the project preliminary approval for both the well and the septic for the lots. We are recommending approval of the project. This concludes my presentation. If Ms. Austin or anyone else has further questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, one of the reasons I have additional questions about this is this like the current zoning in this particular area? I was a little more curious about, I don't know why this is so echoey, sorry. I had more questions about the land use designation in the area than about the project. Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to understand is, so it's zoned for ag, yet you can have single-family homes and some limited commercial in the area, but I was curious if maybe you all could talk about what's kind of contemplated for this general area. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's an area that would continue to be ag, so I guess my question is, like, will it be rezoned? Are we contemplating more single-family homes here?
The area is contemplated to remain in a primarily rural state. The project site, along with The property locations to the north and south are zoned agriculture. The land to the west is rural estates, so it is anticipated to remain in larger lots. As you said, you are correct. Single-family homes are absolutely permitted in the ag zone, so I think the anticipated use for these is lots with a home on them, and the applicant has stated he envisions small farms, for instance, on these lots.
So even though these areas are zoned ag, what we're contemplating is that these neighborhoods in Southport are probably going to be single-family homes with larger footprints. Is that what we anticipate? Do we anticipate it'll be ag? So what I'm trying to get at is I want to be really strategic as we move forward through the Southport kind of framework, where there's a lot of kind of pipeline single-family home development in the area, and if that's the direction that we want to go, then I wonder if that's something we just need to be kind of explicit about.
The framework plan provides for densities starting at this, which would be our lowest density anywhere in the city, all the way till you get up into Stone Lock, where we would expect to see the highest densities, and then sort of really everything, in between. So we have done a few of these smaller maps, over the years where people have gone down to either 2.5 acre parcels in the rural estate or even 5 acre lots, such as proposed here. The designation for ag that's the designation of it. And this would certainly still provide for people doing agricultural uses or having horses, things of that nature. It's just a very, very low density rural area. But the 5 acre, 1 unit per 5 acres has been the sort of the general plan standard really since the framework plan days.
Okay, thanks so much. So yes, I guess just I'll kind of conclude less with a question and more of a statement. So I know there are folks who may contemplate having areas that are used for agriculture, small farms, or more rural uses, and then there are those folks who might, so this is people who are owning or acquiring property, then there are those who are interested in more residential uses. I just want to make sure that as folks are kind of, making plans, it's good to I think it's good to have an idea of what we as a city and what our planning department is contemplating for these areas. So anyway, with that, I'm comfortable with staff recommendation for this item. Did we open the public hearing?
I have not yet.
Okay.
But before I do, I'll ask if any other commissioners have questions or comments for city staff on this item. Hearing none, I'm going to take a moment to open the public hearing. I do not have any requests to speak on this item. No one's jumping up and down. Close the public hearing. All right, folks, so we have made it through, I believe, items 1, 2, and 3 on the consent agenda. Would anyone like to pull any of those items for a separate vote, or can we take them all together?
I'm willing to make a motion to move the consent agenda, items 1, 2, and 3.
I'll second.
So moved by Commissioner Austin, second by Commissioner Liebig. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Very well, the consent agenda passes unanimously. We will now move to our regular agenda.
Just if I can read
Oh,
the
yeah, thank you.
appeal language, please. Any interested party may appeal the decision of the planning commission's matter to the city council by filing a written appeal within the city clerk within 10 days of tonight's filing, at tonight's action, and that appeal must be accompanied by the appropriate filing fee.
Thank you, Mr. Tilly. I always forget my favorite part.
Yes, me too.
We'll move to the regular agenda now. Item 4, public workshop on proposed zoning modernization project, Module 3, administration permits, parking, and non-conforming standards, all the good stuff. Mr. Tilly.
Yes, real briefly, before I turn it over to Martha, we'd like to try to, there's, even though it's one module, so to me, there's sort of, 2 pieces to it. There's the parking part, and then there's the more, how should I say, more administrative part. So I would like for us to work on the parking, recommend that we work on the parking aspect of it and complete that, and then take up the other parts and pieces, after that. We are also going to have a few different city staff who want to provide some input on this topic, given that parking is more than just, striping or how many spaces per per 1,000 square feet, it touches a lot of different areas. So we have representatives from our Public Works Transportation Group here, and I'm also anticipating our newly minted Economic Development Director to be here as well to approach it from that particular angle. So if that's good with the commission, I would like to turn it over to Martha to provide an introduction on where we're going parking-wise.
Any concerns from the commissioner about starting with parking?
None.
All right, very well. Welcome back, Martha. Great to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be back. With you on the zoning modernization project. And just to overall introduction, the overall project is to comprehensively update your zoning code so that it implements and is consistent with your general plan, consistent with state and federal law, and overall is easy to use and understand, so that ultimately West Sacramento sees the type and the quality of development that it wants to see. So we're discussing the third and final set of draft regulations. As David mentioned, it's administration and permits, parking and loading standards, and non-conforming provisions. And after this, we'll be reviewing all of the comments, all of the feedback that we've received to date, and making revisions and putting it together into a full, complete draft zoning ordinance. And then looking at that again, getting feedback, making refinements, and then carrying it forward for formal hearing and adoption. So the first part of Module 3 is parking and loading standards. And before we get into what is drafted as far as standards in the zoning code, we wanted to have a larger discussion about mobility and parking planning, so that overall context, and then as well as what's happening in West Sacramento and where the city, the various programs and where the city itself sees it's going and sees the future for mobility and accessibility. So parking planning is really undergoing a paradigm shift, and we're really starting to question what we have traditionally held as truths about parking. So when we thought about parking before, we really thought that, and it was commonly held, that parking should be free, it should be plentiful, and it should be convenient to my specific destination. And that, if that was provided, that was good parking. And what's happened and what we've recognized is that that has led to and helped feed this kind of cycle of auto dependency. So we have generous parking that's available, more people drive, we have to separate uses because we have to have the parking available and enough of it. All of our transportation planning is then revolved around the automobile. It increases auto ownership. Again, land uses are separated, other modes of transportation aren't viable, and we need more parking and so on. So we got on this kind of loop of auto dependency. And we've started to recognize that our approach, I'll get it sometime, that doesn't work. So it's unfair, if parking is free, those who don't use it are subsidizing those who do use it. It's expensive, so the land is expensive, maintenance of parking areas is expensive, and also what you're giving up as far as redevelopment and development potential. You're losing that investment potential. It encourages driving, so if you can park for free and parking's convenient, why not drive? And overall, it really contradicts a lot of community goals. So our community goals are not just to have free, plentiful parking. There's equity, affordability, reduced traffic problems, cleaner air, more active communities, vibrant communities, and lively neighborhoods. So we're really starting to change our thinking about parking. So where we used to think that a parking problem was not enough parking supply. Now we're recognizing that there can be parking problems if you have too much parking, if people don't know where the parking is, if the parking's too cheap and it's subsidized. We used to think that transportation meant driving. And now, obviously, we're recognizing that there's a whole lot of different ways of getting around, and being mobile, in many cases, are even more effective than just driving. A abundant parking supply is always desired. And now we recognize, well, sometimes too much is just as harmful as too little. That all parking demand should be satisfied on site. So your retail establishment, whoever is going to your retail establishment, you have to provide the parking for them. And now we're realizing, oh, we want interconnected districts and neighborhoods where I'm parking once and I'm going to visit all these different establishments. And I don't feel like I need to move my car every time I'm going to move a different service or a different, I'm going to patronize a different establishment. We also thought parking requirements should be rigid. We thought there was a magic number. We thought, oh, parking demand is 1 per 200 for retail, and that is the right number, and if you don't provide that, there's a problem. Well, now we're recognizing that, oh, there's all these other factors that influence parking demand, and it really varies by a particular situation. Also, innovation. Innovation for mobility and transportation and parking didn't happen as quickly as it's happening now. In some cases where that happens overnight, options for getting around. And then finally, we did actually think for a time that land use dispersion was good, that we wanted that, and that gave us a lot of sprawl. We thought we should separate uses, and now we're rethinking that in our land use as well. So as all of these rethinking is happening. So where we used to have this really kind of linear thought of that we needed free and plentiful and convenient parking, and so the solution was to provide parking. Now we look at it, we're really about overall supporting community objectives. And there's a lot of different ones, and it's about balance. So we want functional, attractive communities. We want affordability, accessibility, equity. We want to reduce impervious surface. We want to increase public health. And so when we think of those goals collectively and together, we realize the solution is more than just providing parking. Providing parking is still part of it. Providing parking or for storage of vehicles, as some people are starting to determine now. But there's a lot more tools that we need to use with that, and it's really about a systems management. We're looking at more travel options, we're looking at enforcement, pricing, information, and all these other things together. And I think it's really great that your city has been really on top of this and starting to develop and put together a lot of those different programs. So I'm going to turn it over to your city staff to describe some of those, and then I'll come back and we can talk about what then is included in the draft standards for parking.
Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. My name is Chris Doherty with the Public Works Department. I'm a transportation planner, and I mostly focus on bicycle and pedestrian planning and general mobility planning. So I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the current mobility elements that the city has deployed recently, and some of the future ones we're going to be deploying. And I'll be talking about those as they relate to parking, as we will move into the future. Probably will need less parking, especially in our urbanizing areas, because of the new mobility elements that are coming into play. Technology is getting well ahead of us right now in this space, and it's really changing how we think about these things. So I'll jump right in. Many people, you might be aware of the new bike share service that we launched recently in May, the Jump Electric Assist bike share bikes that launched 300 bikes between City of Sacramento, City of West Sacramento, and Davis, and they're all linked systems. That system has had roughly 3 times the expected ridership that they anticipated. It has turned into actually to the point where there were not enough bikes available. It probably actually skewed those numbers down. So as we move forward, increasing up to 900 bikes by October, we're going to see that as really a very flexible mobility element through all 3 cities, and really be able to move around as people want to for very inexpensively and easily without the need for parking throughout the urbanizing areas. The second element is the VIA on-demand shared transit service the city launched also in May, I believe the day before Jump, if I'm not mistaken, which is we contracted with a TNC, or like an Uber-like Lyft service called VIA to run an on-demand, app-based ride hailing service. The difference between that and Uber and Lyft is it is a shared system. You might be sharing that ride as it picks you up from down the block, going to your destination. You might have several other people in that vehicle at the same time. So that is really designed to provide a more flexible option than the transit that we currently have, the fixed route transit in town through Yellow Bus. That also, as I understand it, has had about 3,000 trips generated since May, has been more successful than we had intended it to be. It's getting a lot of popularity. It's a really interesting pilot and test case, and we're being watched at the national level about how that succeeds. Also, about 2 years ago, we reprogrammed YOLO Bus to launch the downtown shuttle. And from outside here at the transit center, there is 20-minute headways to take you downtown Sacramento and back. It uses a kind of truncated bit of the streetcar route to emulate some of the streetcar route and to get people to start being used to that service. But as of right now, we do have 20-minute headways from the downtown center, or from the transit center to the downtown area. And as I understand it, it's fairly successful. And we also have the market private approach, which are the Uber and Lyft, which do operate within the city, and a lot of it. Jump was recently acquired by Uber, and we did acquire a little bit of Uber data about their pickup data in West Sacramento, and it was a lot higher than we had anticipated. So we're getting a lot of those kind of TNC transit transportation networked companies operating in the West Sacramento area, going back and forth. In the future, we do tend to program a lot more mobility elements. Last night, the 2018 Bike Ped Master Plan was adopted by City Council, so we are looking to implement that by increasing a lot of the bike parking throughout the city. So we'll be looking at making some amendments to the zoning ordinance to strengthen and bolster the bike parking. Much like the way that we are tackling demand by the end of trip services and storage for vehicles. If we reduce that, people will be less incentivized to travel by car. The more we increase that with for bikes, the more people are incentivized to pick that mode to move around. So that's very important. We are also looking at approaching companies like Zipcar to program car share in our urbanized areas so that people are less reliant on a personally owned vehicle. So there's a lot less need for residential parking in that kind of environment. And we are looking in the future for a riverfront shuttle that is kind of more just being talked about now. It's not really been firmed up what that will look like, but we're talking about that in maybe the next 2 years. And with that, I'm available for any questions you might have, anything I can answer.
So is this the extent, I don't know why there's so much feedback today, sorry. Is this the extent of staff presentation? Are we going to go through a little bit of the detailed, I don't know if there's, I guess my question is kind of what a staff is hoping to get.
No, we
Do we do
do have
questions first and
some
then-
additional presentation for you. I asked Chris to be here tonight to help elaborate, since he's a little more in the weeds on some of these recent innovations. I think the jump bikes is most interesting because we had regular bikes out there, I think, for about a week, and then they were replaced by the electric assist bikes already. This shows how rapidly some of these things have evolved and likely will continue to evolve. And these types of additional transportation modes didn't even exist even like 5 years ago or less. And so as we're trying to keep moving forward, and we want to make sure we're working on our zoning code, not every 25 years, because we're always going to be behind. So we're trying to stay a lot more contemporary as best as we can and keep pace with the evolution of these things that we have right here in our community. And I, for one, see the Via shuttle and the red bikes, all over town, and I have found that some people have a hard time finding the jump bikes because they're in such demand. So I'd like to have, unless you have any questions for Chris, I'd like to have Martha pick up on where she was, and then we'll close it out.
Questions?
Nope. Did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Uh-huh.
So I think this is for Chris. Chris, I really appreciate your presentation, and it's, clearly very exciting about what the future holds for us. I just have some concerns Hopefully you can address them. The first concern that I have is the fact that I conducted an anecdotal poll of the people making these decisions about what the future holds and the restriction of parking, and we all have cars. We can choose to not use a car and use a bike, but it's a choice. You know, we can choose to take a ride-hail service, but that's a choice. You know, we can always go back to our vehicle and use our vehicle to drive anywhere we want. And I think because there is a choice, it's a wildly different scenario than for people who live in a high-density environment where there's not enough parking, where it's unrealistic to buy a car because of the lack of parking. And for people especially who live in affordable housing, who could potentially have a car and work for a company like Lyft or Uber and make money to lift oneself out of poverty, I'm concerned that there might be a situation where people who live maybe on government assistance in affordable housing would rather choose to just stay where they are economically and not try to lift themselves out because they don't have the means or the access that a vehicle provides. Have you guys looked into those type of scenarios?
Well, what I can tell you to address that is it is not the city's intention to limit cars. The city's intention at this point is to offer and to facilitate as many modal choices as possible so people can do exactly what you said, and that is choice. It's when you step out the door, you make an economic choice of how you want to get from point A to point B. If you choose and you have a vehicle and that is the best way for you to do that, that is a choice you are making versus a ride-hailing service or ride-sourcing service or riding a jump bike. What we want to do is provide as many options, because we don't want to dictate how people get around. We want to provide all the options possible so that economic choice is made day in, day out. Because we think when more choices are offered to people, whether you're in a high-density environment or either a mid-density or a low-density environment, there should be context-sensitive choices programmed for each of those environments. And if those choices are there, people will make the decision that fits the best for their trip. You may have a car, but you may commute downtown, and it may be very difficult for you to park there. Again, that end-of-trip storage is always going to be an issue. And as we grow, that will be more and more of an issue on this side of the river as well. But so does that answer your question appropriately?
It does, and I do have a couple of follow-up
Sure.
questions as well. You know, I looked at a study commissioned by APTA, that is the American Public Transportation Association, and one of their conclusions was that the large majority of people who use ride-hail service like Lyft and Uber have a median household income of $90,000, about that range. So, I mean, basically middle income, upper income type people. And there was a different study commissioned by the University of Pennsylvania where they gave low income folks free Lyft rides to their doctor's appointments, completely free. And there was no increase in service. They essentially, there was no reduction in missed appointments because these folks who didn't have a car and used the bus or walked or ride bicycles were now given free rides through Lyft. They still did not reduce the missed appointment rate, if that makes any sense. And the conclusion was, even free ride-hail service isn't utilized more by low-income folks. And they really couldn't figure out why that was the case. And there were some assumptions made, but the data was clear that for them in this study that folks who are low income typically don't use those type of services. They would rather rely on the bus or their own car.
Sure.
Have you guys looked at that?
So we did, and that's precisely why we went with a VIA-style platform that is not ride sourcing, it's ride sharing, and there's a very important distinction there. You call an Uber or Lyft, someone is still driving you around. This service was still wanted, it was important to us to uphold the basic tenets of transit, where it reduced vehicle miles traveled and still met the equity challenges that most transit does have. So what we have done to address that is we've reached out, we've done a lot of outreach to the senior population in the city. Actually, we've had over 100 of our local seniors sign up for the VIA platform, and they're using it a lot. It's actually been a very successful platform for that user group. And then I think what the failing is on a lot of these is the marketing, how you get down and target that group. I do feel if a free service was given to people, they probably just didn't know it existed, because it's really hard to kind of target market some of these groups. We have tried here in the city, really trying to get into these groups that we think are going to be big opportunities to use VIA and JUMP. Both have large equity analysis components to it and marketing campaigns that are moving through, and specialized plans that are targeted to a lower income user group. Because we're trying to not build the more concierge service like a ride sourcing, an Uber or Lyft, out of this service. That is not our intent from the city. It really is to build something that emulates public transportation, but is more flexible to see if we can increase our ridership across the board.
Okay, well, I'm very satisfied with your explanation, and you sold me, so thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Can I weigh in, because we can't have this discussion without me weighing in on this. So we talk about housing, transportation, and social equity, and you know you're going to hear from me. So a couple of points. I think it's important to note that we hosted locally a national conference on the 3 revolutions in transportation innovation, and I moderated the panel on social equity, so I would love to address some of these pieces. So one thing that we're consistently hearing is that in affordable housing developments, a large proportion of people don't own cars due to financial issues, and in fact, those who can avoid car ownership can have more disposable income. And depending, even within this car-centric metro area, we are seeing in the areas of 25 and 30% of residents in affordable housing don't own cars and are reliant on active transportation and transit. So being able to support affordable transit options and invest in our active transportation is actually leans towards providing providing kind of a social equity aspect. And then to your point about TNCs being an opportunity for economic development. So there's many ways that people can pull themselves out of poverty, and that's not the only way. However, there's some really neat pilot programs that have been happening through public housing at the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency and 2 local affordable housing developers who are working on having electric vehicles that are available in their developments for folks to share, sort of like a Zipcar model, and also to have sort of an Uber rideshare model where residents can either volunteer or be paid to give rides to their neighbors. And those have been wildly successful. And so there's been a lot of interest in seeing how those can expand. So I love that we're having this discussion, but I do think that some of the things that West Sacramento is doing are really awesome, and really West Sacramento and even our partners, again, throughout the region are really trying to look at transportation through a really important equity lens. And then the last thing I'll say is that in West Sac, we're doing some really novel things, even on a national scale. But what I want to be quick to point out is something that I said at a recent planning commission meeting, is that we're not a unicorn here. That for many folks, it feels like some of the changes that we're making around parking, around active transportation, around density, and around housing, many communities are struggling with this. They're struggling with much denser housing. Their communities look and feel differently. And so while West Sacramento is really on the cutting edge, in the next 5 years, pretty much every community around California is going to be doing the same things that we are already doing. So we're only a little ahead of the curve. We're a few months or a few single-digit years ahead of the curve. And so I think we're just trying to plan for the future a little bit better than some of our other sister cities might be. But so thank you very much for that, for some of the perspectives that you shared. And I think it's hard. Throughout our state, we're going through some pretty significant growing pains around transportation and mobility planning.
I will add, we are watching that SHRA program closely. I think we could be ripe for a similar program. We just need to align some funding and figure out how to do that. But my shop is looking at that very closely.
Right, thank you.
And why we wanted to kind of start with that kind of overview is so that that's in context when we look at what's drafted as the parking regulations. And it's really about to see that the focus of a lot of what your city is doing is no longer the automobile is the number one thing. And that's with your mobility and your circulation planning, your land use. We don't need to be dependent on the private automobile. It's about choice. That doesn't mean parking's going to disappear overnight. It doesn't mean that there will be no more parking. It's just that that's not the only thing that we're relying on. So with that, the parking and loading standards in Module 3 start with first the applicability. So it's pretty easy that with new buildings and land uses that you need to provide parking. What gets a little more difficult is when you have a change of use. You have an existing building and existing site development, and what we heard and what staff saw happening is sometimes that limited the ability for those buildings or those properties to be reused, because every different use had a new parking calculation that needed to be done. And then sometimes you needed to provide one extra parking spot, but your site was already developed and there was no way to provide that on there. And as such, then that property, the building was left vacant. And we actually, when stakeholder we talked to early in the process was looking at putting a t-shirt business in, needed one extra parking space in, and couldn't locate their business there. So with the change or expansion of use for non-residential, you would need to provide additional parking when that change of use requires an increase of 30% or more in the number of required parking and 10 new spaces are required. So it's really just if there's a significant kind of change that causes a big intensity of parking demand that you would need to provide additional parking. And then with residential, existing residential, if a new unit is created, you'd need to provide additional parking, not if you're just simply adding square footage.
This was actually one area I had questions on. Do you mind if I ask my questions? So let's see. So let's tackle the first one. The first one first. So this looks like then it's for at least 10 spaces. So what I'm hearing then is that it's not for businesses that maybe with the change of use need to add a single-digit number of parking spaces. Okay, so that's helpful to know. And then for the second one, I had concerns, and maybe you'll be able to address this later, about ADUs. So we're looking at implementation of new legislation from the state level, and I want to make sure that in an effort to increase both the quantity of housing stock as well as an opportunity for some income for people to be able to develop on their properties, I just want to be sensitive to what kind of implications that will be, whether that might create a hardship. So I don't know if you're going to address ADUs, or how would this, like, for example, someone has a home and they want to build a granny, so like building a granny unit or an in-law unit on their property, what kind of implications would this have?
So accessory dwelling units are really kind of a separate animal, and it has its own parking requirements, which was included in the last module, so I can't bring it off the top of my head, but there's many cases in which, per state law, you're not allowed to require parking for that accessory dwelling unit, so.
Okay, because I just want to make sure we're not going to put something
Right.
in that doesn't follow
That's
state law
contrary.
and is confusing, yeah.
Exactly.
And technically illegal, and then we'll be called out on when we're trying to implement.
Right.
Yeah, and then also, if you could expand a little bit about, so the increase in parking, can you be a little more specific about on-site, off-site, sharing, are these things that are contemplated in this?
Yes. So parking is required to be located on-site unless you meet the requirements for an off-site parking allowance, which starts on page 10, which has some things about location and then having an agreement.
This just came up very recently during a particularly contentious item where off-street parking was being counted towards the requirement. So again, when you have these real-life examples, I want to make sure that the policies we put in place are, again, consistent with state law and also consistent with because for me, that was a desirable use that was consistent with what we envisioned for that particular area, and I don't want to see that type of situation played out with what we're existing. That was a change in use, so that is a different thing.
Yeah, and we have 10% in the municipal code now, and I wanted to up this and also add the 10 thing. And there's been a few projects over the years that have stuck out in my mind on this, and the most egregious example was the groomer, pet groomer that was
On
on
Jefferson.
Jefferson, where I think we spent about an hour here at Planning Commission debating one parking space. And I think it was a house, so instead of requiring 3, he needed 4, or was it 4 to 5? The difference was 4 to 5 in the little parking lot that they put in the back of that property. And I know in a couple of months here, probably you're going to see a use permit come through for a brewery on Drever Street where there is no on-site parking because there is none. And there's a building there, and those are all small lots over there, and so all the parking's going to have to be off-site or on-street. So we're trying to get some more flexibility to try to address these real-world things that have come up and will likely continue to come up as we infill and refill some of these areas. And the Drever Street area, which we're starting to call the snow cone area, is a prime example of an area where there is no possibility to provide on-site parking short of bulldozing the building where you were going to put the use in, and then, well, if there's no use, you don't need the parking. So we've been caught in this sort of conundrum several times over the years. We're trying to get a little more latitude on that to address those situations that have come up several times and may continue to come up in the future.
Great, thank you for that.
To piggyback off of Commissioner Austin's, thank you, Martha. I also have some comments in this section, particularly with the existing non-residential buildings. This phrase pops up in a couple spots. Existing parking and loading shall be maintained. So if you have an existing use and it turns into a new use and it's over-parked, we're saying that we need to maintain that as originally built or per the current requirements. It's not really clear on that. And it pops up in 2 spaces. I hate reading off the numbers, but it's 17, 27, 20, B2
So
is 1.
that should be clarified, because the intent is that if you're underparked, you can't further reduce your parking. If you would be required to have 10 and you only have 5, well, you can't then go down to 2. So I think that's a clarification.
Okay, and then the very next section is 17, 27, 30A. No existing parking and loading may be reduced in amount or changed in design or location below the requirements for such use. And that's where I think it's just a clarification. Are we talking about the current?
Well,
current
it's
zoning?
below the requirements for the use. So if you're required to have 5 and you have 5, you can't put in 4 unless you replaced that 1 somewhere else. So the key part is can't be reduced below the requirements.
Below the current requirements.
Right, whatever you're required to have, you can't
Right.
reduce it further.
Okay, so throwing this out, why I'm stumbling, Safeway's parking lot is gigantic. It was never fully used, and I absolutely don't want us to be committed to keeping that large of a parking lot when we could put another building in there. There could be another commercial use that activates that corner and better utilizes that parking lot. That's just
So
one of the
with the new parking standards in here, which I'll talk just generally about the changes to it, the parking requirements might have actually gone down for that. So they might actually, if this were to go through, have excess parking. With that, though, if a new building were to come in, so let's say the new requirements go in and they still are required that exact amount of parking. If a building came in through the parking reduction process in here, that could be lowered. So the zoning administrator or the planning commission could make findings that says, hey, through the nature of this use, they don't need that much parking.
Okay.
And could reduce it.
Okay.
So in general, for the number of parking spaces required. So in general, they're, for each use, reduced and standardized. So what you have currently is each use is listed, and then there's the the parking ratio required. Well, we looked at, wherever possible, to have those ratios for similar uses be the same, so that as things change and morph, and staff is not, and your city is not always looking to recalculate the parking. It was 1 per 400 before, you changed the use, the parking requirement is still 1 per 400. It makes it easy. That really helps with that reuse and redevelopment, reinvestment. So the general approach was to, across the board, reduce and standardize. And then there are lower parking requirements in urban infill areas, which is similar to what you have now in you have kind of urban standards and suburban standards. So overall reduced, also keeping the lower parking requirements in your urban infill areas. Also in your urban infill areas, there's a maximum number of parking spaces that's allowed. So there's a cap of what you can provide. And you have that in your code currently. We've made some refinements to it to kind of standardize it and make that calculation easier. So still the same concept, but just standardized. There's requirements in for both long-term and short-term parking. So short-term is typically, bike racks. Longer term is something that's secured and sometimes protected from the elements. And then requirements for loading, your standard commercial industrial development loading, as well as for multi-tenant residential development, as you're looking at reducing parking requirements and having less just kind of space for people to move in and out. So, and that was something that staff has experienced with some projects coming through.
And then for bicycle parking, just all the sections, have you had a chance for representatives from SABA kind of to weigh in? I've looked through, and it seems that, for example, section 1727-07 on page 11, that's cute and rhymes, that seems to reflect some of the issues that I've heard raised by, like, the SABA executive director, but I don't know if you've, I see nodding and I see Chris standing.
I think this one's in my wheelhouse. I will say in the Bike and Pedestrian Trails Master Plan that was adopted last night, we have adopted the and forgive me, it's 2 nights of evening meetings, my brain's, what the appropriate standards for bike parking. And this was actually my suggestion here on the long and short-term bike parking. And the genesis is this: a restaurant needs very different bike parking than an office building. It needs a lot more short-term parking, but still some long-term parking, whether it's lockers or a locked-in facility for the people that work there, versus the office space that maybe needs some short-term parking for visitors, but a lot of locked-up space for commuters to come in there. So that's really the genesis of this. But our new parking standards for bikes will conform to the national standards. It is a known deficiency here in the city for our bike parking, and we have actually leveraged the JUMP rollout to get a lot more additional public bike parking through there. But we will be looking to use this ordinance to bring our standard significantly up to national standards through this process.
That's helpful, and you probably know this, but one of the things that comes up too is the type and also location. Like long-term parking, long-term bike parking, you want in one type of area, and you also want the short-term parking more visible near the entrance, but you may not necessarily want that for the employees using long-term bike parking. So it looks like that's all been captured. I just wanted to confirm that.
And I will confirm that Jim Brown will be heavily involved, as he was in the Bike Ped Master Plan, going through this process.
Great, thank
He'd probably
you.
be here tonight, but he's actually teaching our traffic safety course at the police station.
Perfect. Thank you.
So those are the base parking requirements. And then, because as we talked about, we realize that there's no one magic number for every situation. There's also opportunities for reductions in those standard rates. And so one is just a reduction for ground floor non-residential uses in those urban infill areas. So the first 5,000 square feet of ground floor residential or non-residential there's no parking required for that. There's reductions for if there's motorcycle parking can be provided in lieu of an automobile space. Some reductions for sites with multiple uses if you have transit accessibility, if car sharing parking and programs are provided. And then there's others that are subject to discretionary review. So if for some reason there's a particular situation that the applicant feels warrants that, they can request that through a public process. And then finally, there's the requirements for parking area design and location. And this gets to the earlier comment of that off-site parking is allowed located within basically a quarter mile in urban infill areas and a shorter distance in other areas. To provide some flexibility for parking configuration, tandem parking is allowed. Shared access is also encouraged to, not to try and avoid that everybody has their own dedicated access and space. Then there's the typical parking space dimensions, striping, curbing, lighting, circulation, and then there's also some provisions or some performance standards for reducing the heat island effect, and that's providing shading, which is requirements for landscaping in the parking lots, but we recognize that landscaping itself doesn't always provide the amount of shading that we hope to have, so there's, you can provide it other ways too, whether covered, solar panels, or you could do light covered pavement is also an option. So it's really just meeting a performance standard for that.
Martha, can I ask a quick question here?
Yep.
Is there a reason why we would set the maximum number of feet that off-site parking could be allowed in some kind of agreement versus just letting the market determine what's an appropriate distance for someone?
Well, that certainly could be something for, the city to decide. The idea behind a distance, and everybody feels comfortable with a different distance, is that, it has to be in a place that somebody is actually going to, if the parking is for this use, it has to be in close enough proximity that the person who parks over here is going to access that use. So some kind of connection. But it certainly doesn't, have to be there, or it doesn't have to be a certain number.
David, do you have any?
Well, yeah, just as an example, if for this building, if parking was a mile away, would somebody realistically park in a lot a mile away, then walk the rest of the way to our building? I agree that there ought to be some level of proximity, just, practically speaking, if, someone is going to, park a vehicle in an off-site location, how far, assuming how far are they going to go from that off-site location to whatever their destination is? And, and different people will have different levels of comfort in terms of, how far they're going to walk, from wherever they left their vehicle to get somewhere. So we've had things like this. We've tried to increase these a little bit over the years, again, to provide some additional flexibility and to also allow new projects to take advantage of existing parking resources, such as, hopefully someday, the Ziggurat Garage, or even in the Ridge District where we've built that parking lot over there, and then everyone within a quarter mile, is eligible to use it should they choose to.
I would also add, just as a bit of context, about 1,300 feet is about 3 city blocks. So you could technically site a garage anywhere in Washington, and almost everywhere in the Washington neighborhood could utilize that garage with this calculation.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I guess I think that I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but it just, at a quarter mile, it's like, okay, well, what's the point? Like, it almost feels like we may, I don't know if 3 city blocks is enough between that lot you're talking about by Rayleigh Field and the entrance to Rayleigh Field. That to me could almost be a little more than a quarter of a mile. And not to use that as a end-all be-all example, but I guess I worry just at a quarter mile, it just seems like one of those limits where if something was 1,400 feet, are we going to stop a project from moving forward, or?
In that, in that scenario, they could, either go through a minor use permit or come to planning commission on that. This is, something we have on the books, and we'll have probably, at least for the foreseeable future, until we have a much more robust public supply of parking available. Presently, we have the one, city lot, well, two city lots, the one across from here, and then the one in the Bridge District. I would anticipate the city ultimately generating additional public parking in different locations to where hopefully we can get to a point where we're sort of, there's enough parking in different areas, publicly available, that maybe this won't even be necessary anymore. But right now, we don't have at least a large public off-street, supply of parking yet. But, as Chris mentioned, ultimately we will do a garage in Washington. We may ultimately do one in Bridge District. Part of the plans for the Civic Center area across the street is a garage in the center of that property between the college and the library. So if we get to that point where there's a robust supply of public parking available, then, maybe something like this becomes unnecessary at that point.
Okay.
I think the other perspective, and it's crazy that I'm even bringing this up, is that what we're outlining here is what basically can be approved by the zoning administrator, and things that deviate outside of this need to come to the planning commission, not necessarily only for us to weigh in, but to allow for public input. So that's what I think it is. I think that studies have shown that people will walk up to a quarter mile. And so regardless of whether that's accurate or not, I think it's fair to say that, up to that, that's a fair recommendation, and that things that deviate, to your point, like a 1,400 feet rather than 1,350, that's when it comes before here, and local business owners, property owners, stakeholders can kind of weigh in and say, yeah, no, we're comfortable with that use, or no, we have concerns that there's not enough parking in that vicinity. So that's my sense of why that number was picked, but I guess it's to be kind of defensible for zoning administrator approval.
Yeah, I know, like in Sacramento, for example, on a lot of their new residential projects, they're not requiring any parking at all on site. And I think part of how that can work is that they do have numerous garages and other facilities sort of scattered around downtown, and you're usually not much more than a few blocks from a city parking lot or garage, somewhere. So that's, ultimately where I think we will get to, at least in our more urbanizing areas. We're not quite there yet, but we already are moving in that direction by virtue of having some, city lots that we didn't even have even a few years ago.
Thanks.
And so just finally with going on about the flexibility and the ability for alternatives, there's also a provision in there for alternative parking area design. So somebody can submit proposals for more kind of environmentally friendly design of parking areas, and the zoning administrator can consider those if you can show that, it meets the intent of the design requirements, but it has achieved more environmental design goals. And that concludes my summary of the parking and loading standards, and we can either continue with the discussion on that, or I can go through an overview of non-conforming and administration and permits, and then continue the discussion.
I've got another question, because of course I do. When I was doing development, what I found sometimes was not the limiting factor were the city's zoning standards, but instead waste removal and fire. And so I wonder, to what extent is that being addressed here? Have they weighed in? Because again, functionally, when you're on the ground, that's a bigger issue with having enough parking or the right kind of spaces for loading, et cetera.
Yeah, we've come a long way on those issues. Particularly with fire, over the years, they've actually reduced their turning radius standards.
That's exactly what I'm asking, yeah.
From what they had been, and they actually went out in the field and coned them off and verified, that those could work. That was, been several years ago now. Waste collection has typically been the Achilles heel on a lot of our projects, particularly infill, because that was the days when we had pretty much a one-size-fits-all type collection system. We are definitely now, with that most recent waste management contract, there are other waste collection services available, with different types of vehicles, to try to recognize our diversification of our housing types and forms here in our community, to where, this suburban model, is just really not workable. And fortunately now we're getting enough of those types of housing projects built where it can help also justify, having different types of vehicles and different collection mechanisms, and then different cost breakdowns for those services. So I have run into those things tremendously over the years, and fortunately we have made a lot of headway on both topics and over the years, and especially more recently with waste management. So, but those are one of the things we definitely try to address a lot sooner. Fire trucks may go out there once in a lifetime, but we know the garbage trucks are out there every week in multiple vehicles for, recycling, trash, everything else. So we have definitely made progress in those regards and made our infill projects a lot more doable than they had been in the past.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So I'm sure other commissioners have questions and comments. Commissioner Liebig, do you have any questions or comments for C-Staff on this one?
Not at this time.
No? Commissioner Harrison?
No.
Commissioner Vu? Okay, I stand corrected. I do. EV charging. So I noticed it's mentioned once on page 16 and says charging stations may be provided in an area designed for the parking or loading of vehicles. Are we not going to have any EV charging requirements, or are we, and at what point?
Well, we've discussed it, so through the building code, there is some requirements for EV charging, and what gets kind of difficult if then we also have those address the same thing in zoning. So there's a couple of the things the city could do. One, you could put some in here, and we can do that. The other would be you could amend your building code to enhance what is require more than that base. We also think the state, as it has its mandates and it's making its push and investment in electric vehicles and infrastructure, that state law may soon quickly preempt whatever we put in here, much like we're seeing with accessory dwelling units and telecommunication facilities and so on. So we have had the discussion with staff about what is the appropriate way to go, and at least with this draft, we thought to leave it out and let it lie with the building code.
Can I just ask then that we're explicit in linking it to the building code here?
Sure.
And saying that for more information on EV charging stations, please see building code section.
Yeah, Cal Green has some requirements in there, but we're already experiencing major competition, and we have a serious lack of EV charging stations. Fortunately,
Correct.
there are more on the way. But what I wanted to make sure we got in here is at least that EV charging provision were in there, and much like accessible spaces, we count those toward the overall total. They're not in addition to, toward the total parking requirement. But we absolutely need more EV charging in town, and right now you can count on one hand almost how many chargers we have in our community.
Yeah, and I get the argument on the state law preemption eventually, but I don't really see that happening tomorrow. And for our general plan goals and all the other goals that we espoused as a city, it just kind of seems odd to me that we would pass on an opportunity to set an EV target goal for new parking facilities, or at least provide some kind of incentive for folks to reach certain levels of EV charging.
Yeah, we can work on that a little further.
Any other questions, Ms. Austin? So my only other question is, I don't think we got to see as a commission the bike and ped master plan, so I'd love it if Katie could send us all a copy. 'Cause I don't think it came here on its way to council.
We can, that's Chris's charge, so.
Yep, understood.
we
I think it has a lot of planning components into it, especially in the context of tonight's conversation, and I was not aware myself that it went to council last night, but I'd just like to read it.
I'll be happy to send a copy out to the commission. I'm still need to swap out one cover photo, and then it'll go out for public consumption, but should be available on the website as well, too, very soon.
Thank you. All right, so any other comments on the parking and loading standards? Seeing none, let's move to the rest,
Okay.
as I'll call it.
And we'll start with the non-conforming provision. So one of the big changes in approach for the non-conforming provisions was to treat different non-conforming uses with different properties, treat them differently. Right now, what your code has is really a one-size-fits-all approach to non-conforming uses, but we recognize that not all non-conforming uses are the same. There certainly are the ones that are detrimental and causing a problem and are inconsistent with health and safety and the vision of where your city wants to go. At the same time, there's some of those that are benign and sometimes even beneficial to the area that they're in. They've been there forever, people are attached to them, they provide some benefit. So what's included here is really that uses are really, non-conforming uses are treated differently. So there's class 1, and these are considered benign. They can remain or be substituted with zoning administrator review. The second is class 2, which is, it really should be replaced at some point in the future to reach your general plan objectives, but they're not immediately detrimental to the surrounding areas. So there's more restrictions on expansions and substitutions, but they can remain. And then the third is really a high bar, and that's where their non-conforming uses are determined to be detrimental. So they're really actually causing a problem and a public nuisance. And that goes through quite a process of designation for that by the city council, and then the city council would, through a lot of information and determination, establish a termination date or a termination period. So that's really kind of the big changes with that. And so that's for non-conforming uses. There's other things in this set that really applies to if things are damaged, non-conforming structures damaged as part of a fire, and when they need to be rebuilt in accordance with the current rules and regulations, or when they can be rebuilt as they were. Those pretty much mirror what you have currently. And then there is standards for non-conforming kind of site features. And basically, if you have, say, a house and you had a non-conforming setback, you can still add on to that house. Whatever you're adding on needs to comply to today's rules. The exception for that is just, actually with a non-conforming setback, you could continue that setback a lot, further back. So you can't encroach any further, and it would have to be on the first floor. But the idea with that is if you have a non-conforming setback, say it's like 1 foot into the setback, and you want to do an addition, it's weird to have a little 1 foot jog. So the flexibility or the allowance is, okay, you could just continue that back as long as it's on the first floor and there's no additional encroachment. So the second big set is administration and permits, and this is for the administration of the zoning code. And this really is a maintenance and repackage of, to a large degree, your existing provision. So the idea is, the processes really, for the most part, stay the same, but hopefully they're more easy to follow and understand what that process is. So it starts with just an identification of the planning authorities. Who's making the decision, who's the appeal body, and what chapter to look for those processes. The next chapter is common procedures. So there's, any permit that needs public noticing, the provisions for public noticing are in here. So all the procedures that are common to multiple types of permit of approvals are included in one chapter. The next chapter is the zoning clearance, and that is really just that basic, whatever somebody wants to do, a planner's going to check it to make sure it conforms with the zoning code. So if you want a business license for a restaurant, the planner's going to make sure you're allowed to have a restaurant on that property.
So if I may, this is the last slide and then the subsequent ones. This is kind of what I was talking about, where there's some really valuable information. Frankly, it was pretty perfunctory and pretty logical in my mind. So I could follow it, but this is the kind of thing where I want to build an addition to my house. What was what's the process? Or, I think that the web-based interface for this section, I think, is going to be really critical. So, I'm sure that it hasn't really necessarily been developed, but it'd be something I would love to see. It doesn't, I don't think, have to be in a public hearing, but if there was kind of like a beta testing, I'd be very interested in seeing what that would look like.
And this is really, so the process that you're required to go through for a certain type of approval will be identified throughout the code, and then you say, oh, okay, I need a use permit. How do I do a use permit? And then this has the provisions for the use permit. The city may develop some handouts for those current, consistently requested type of things, and that could walk through that process of, I want to replace my windows, whatever that kind of is.
Okay, great, thanks.
The next section is design review, and this really carries forward your current process, which it's applicable to areas of the city where design guidelines and criteria have been adopted. And the Planning Commission conducts it for anything that goes to the Planning Commission. If some type of approval doesn't go to the Planning Commission, then the director conducts the design review. In use permits, this is where there's,
I'm sorry, if you take a step back, because Planning Commission currently is not the design review, is that correct? So this is different?
Yeah, this is something I personally have wanted to clean up, for years.
Yes.
Because we bring a lot of projects here where they need design review, but then we have to tell you, oh, well, you guys can't touch that part. And to me, the design review on a lot of these maps and other things, the design review, in my opinion, is probably the most critical piece of the puzzle, more so than the map, which to me is like the mechanics of implementing a project. So this is a change. The reason why it is the way it is when former Director Steve Paddock brought this forward to Planning Commission. You got 7 different opinions on, some people really wanted it, some people didn't want to touch it at all, the council didn't want it, so we left with where we are now. But I definitely favor when a project is coming to the Planning Commission anyway, for a map, use permit, whatever it is, I think it's best to allow the commission to look at that project holistically, which includes design review to the extent it's required. But we'd love to hear if that's something the commission wants. My thought was it probably would.
Yeah, I mean, this to me was one of the most dramatic changes, that we haven't been design review, and now we are design review, so I'm in strong favor of that. But I would also say that it might be helpful if, when we do kind of our annual commissioner orientations, or at that time or another time, if there was an opportunity to workshop a little bit of that, because we do kind of crash course some of these other land use things, but when it comes to design, it might help for us to have a little bit of the vocabulary. Like, I don't expect us to become architects overnight, but it'd be helpful to have that vocabulary so we could more clearly articulate what we do or don't like about, when we're workshopping or talking to an applicant.
Yeah, and I would like to, clarify that, design review will be review of the project against the applicable criteria that are in the design guidelines, be it in Washington or Bridge District, Central, but wherever we have design guidelines. So we really want to avoid getting what is inherently a subjective thing.
Make it pink, not blue.
Yeah, those are the kind of things we want to stay away from. And there's lots of examples of where design review can really go off the rails in other places. So we want to make sure that we do have a clear path forward on that. But we certainly can help facilitate that. Even I struggle sometimes with some of the vocabulary, or at least articulating what I'm thinking on some of these things. But
like community character, fencing, that's totally within our purview with design review. So I think those kinds of things, it'd be helpful for us to articulate what we were trying to say.
Well, I agree, but all roads back to having quality design guidelines that are clear and objective, as at least as objective as they can be, so that there is understood of what the expectation is, and then we can hopefully then marry that in a nice package for the commission when it's coming with some other alternative. We don't want to get to the point where we're trying to pick what type of grass someone is going to put in, but we have fundamental design guidelines, and I encourage all of you to review those. The most recent one we did was the ones, Volume 4 of the Bridge District Plan. But we also have them for West Capitol, Washington, Southport. Some of those are getting a bit dated now, but we do want to make sure that, design review is not like an open-ended thing. But I personally believe it makes sense to have that be considered by the commission if you're considering some other aspect of the project anyway.
Thank you.
So I apologize for not characterizing that correctly, and what's similar is that it's only applicable to those certain areas that have design guidelines and criteria. And so staff would still do the review and the analysis and make a recommendation on it, but you would make that decision with the entirety of the project. So this definitely has the change, and I think we mentioned it in some earlier times when I was here. So for use permits, there's a new type of use permit, which is the minor use permit. So there will be two types: conditional use permits, which are reviewed by the Planning Commission and require public notice and hearing, and that's what you have now. The minor use permits are new, where the review would be by the zoning administrator, and there is public notice, but there's only a public hearing if somebody requests a public hearing. So something might go out, everybody's fine with it, nobody has an opinion, there wouldn't be a hearing. But if somebody requests a hearing, there would be one with the zoning administrator, and the zoning administrator can also elevate it to Planning Commission for consideration. Temporary use permits, so in Module 2, we discussed standards for certain types of temporary uses, and some of those required a temporary use permit, so these are the provision, the procedures for that. And then modifications, allowance for consideration of relief of different locational, developmental, operational requirements, similar to what you have now. You can't modify lot dimensions or density. And then if you're requiring a modification in conjunction with another project or in that entitlement, it all gets kind of considered and packaged together. Variances similar to what you have now, and that's really where that strict application of the zoning ordinance deprives somebody of the use of the property that other similar properties have. Reasonable accommodation, these just carry forward your existing provisions that allow for reasonable accommodation for state and federal laws that require this for fair housing and other certain protected uses. Finally, provisions for development agreements, which enables the city to implement certain parts of the development or the government code for going into agreements with private parties. And then the provisions for amendments to the general plan, zoning code, zoning map. These are standard where the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to the city council, and the city council is the legislative body. Provisions for pre-zoning, which, to zone a property if it were going to be annexed, and then enforcement. So procedures for the enforcement of code regulations. It works together with Title 19, which is your nuisance abatement code. So it includes definition of nuisance, the remedies, and the opportunity to take care of whatever the violation is, and those provisions. So that covers the rest of it.
Awesome. Thank you, Martha. Why don't we start with Ms. Austin again?
Are you sure you want to start me? So in code enforcement, that's also another really big topic. What kind of tools do we have, the carrots and sticks? What's interesting to me is not just kind of punitive measures, but in what way can we work with property owners? I mean, in the majority of the cases, the property owners just don't have the resources to do what they need to do to get it to code. I'm less concerned with just negligence, but if you want to talk maybe anecdotally about what you've done in the past, or any programs that you might have for working with property owners.
We have had different things, over the years. Some of that did go away with redevelopment.
Right.
But our code enforcement staff, to their credit, they're not out there just trying to put the hammer on somebody on day one. Voluntary compliance is always, the objective. And we've gotten a lot better about that, and we don't bring very many things to the hearing officer anymore, like we used to do. And they also though prioritize the most, severe matters, which are substandard housing issues, which we still have a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of life safety things, to where, they will go after those things, much more aggressively, and they don't pursue every last little minor technical, thing, that comes up out there. But ultimately, they will, address those, but with 4 officers, they prioritize the most severe matters, first. And, some of those cases are very severe if you read some of the details. So we always, I know that they're, just working with people, they're flexible, they will give them time as long as they're making progress. Oftentimes, the remedy to a code enforcement case may be a building permit, something like that. So when someone comes in the door, we try to facilitate getting them that building permit to try to remedy that, whatever that matter was, and then to try to close it out. So I feel like they do have somewhat of the, carrot and stick approach, and only really pull out the stick in the most severe, situations, which unfortunately still do come up periodically. But these provisions in here, we definitely need to have these on the books. It's not the kind of thing that typically bubbles up to the planning commission, but we do need to have these provisions in here and need to continue to work and improve, particularly Title 19, which has been I think, very effective, but we can always continue to improve on it as well.
Great, thank you. And then my second, and don't worry, gentlemen, last question is around the non-conforming use. So we have many communities, particularly because of our recent general plan updates in this effort, that are going to be non-conforming uses, or that we would like to, they may actually be that kind of class 1, but we would like to encourage, other uses maybe in and around it. So is there a strategy around addressing non-conforming uses? And I do think they differ. I think that industrial versus other uses is different, and I also think geography is different, because we will probably treat communities and Pioneer Bluffs differently than we're going to treat them on West Capitol. So I don't know if maybe economic development has a strategy or something.
Well, yeah, they are, and that's what the whole Pioneer Bluff transition plan was all about, which I think we talked about at our last, commission meeting. This is an area of this document we still need to work further with, particularly with Jeff's office on this. And we learned a lot through that matter on South River Road that we had late last year, I think it was, and how nonconforming uses are viewed, in these days, particularly in the eyes of the courts, as compared to how we thought. Our goal still is to ultimately have nonconforming uses ultimately transition into conforming uses, recognizing that may still take a long time in various areas, but we want to make sure that we are respecting those uses that were lawfully established at the time, but they still may continue short of doing a formal amortization, program. Which, as I told someone earlier today, I think the only time I can recall we've ever done that was with all the pole signs. And that was a 15-year amortization just on pole signs, let alone trying to get other uses out. But we do need to continue to work on this further as it's presented to you tonight. Jeff has been, elbowing me all evening about this. But it is an important topic, because even before general plan, is a fairly young city, we definitely have a lot of non-conforming uses out there. And they've always been a bit of a challenge, to deal with, but the overall policy objective is to have them ultimately, transition toward conforming uses. Where we've gotten a little more hung up in more recent years is when the substitution of non-conforming use, concept, and we have done use permits for those, and has always been a bit of a blunt tool, in my view, for that situation. And this is also grappling, you mentioned Pioneer Bluff, where we all know what the grand future is out there, but it's what do we do in the meantime to try to keep moving toward that.
And West Cap is no different. West Cap is on a different scale, but it's the same thing. We have a lot of
It is. It is.
And again, it's like, you're talking about small businesses and, it's like, well, this is not necessarily the best fit, but they're also small businesses that serve a purpose, whether they're, mechanics or other things like that. So I just want to be sensitive that this is, for me, non-conforming uses is that nexus between land use policy as well as our economic development strategy. And so there's pieces that are kind of planning commission, but there's also broader, interdepartmental things we need to address.
Yeah, and certainly, empty buildings don't do anybody, any good. But at some point in time, you really got to start moving in the right direction. But we recognize that, where all the, like, say, high-rise residential things in Pioneer Bluffs, not likely to occur, in any relatively short order. So it's all about how do we handle things in the meantime while trying to still move in that direction, but still trying to let property owners at least get some level of economic value out of their properties and not just a bunch of empty buildings that will likely become just, problems. So this is one of the toughest things that we definitely grapple with in this arena.
Great. Well, thank you so much for letting me ask all the questions I had tonight, folks.
So normally I kick it down the line, but since we're on this topic, of non-conforming use, this was actually the part of the document I had the most concerns, questions about. So I was glad to hear that Jeff's been poking you all night. So I'll just kind of summarize my high-level concerns and then have an ask at the end. But I'm a couple things. First is Class 1 is really clearly laid out as far as what's allowed, what's not, who's making the decisions, what criteria they're looking at. Class 2 and Class 3 feel like almost afterthoughts, where they're like literally just a paragraph saying, but we could do this. But Class 2 or Class 3 don't even specify who would make that call, whereas in Class 1 it says, I believe pretty clearly, the zoning administrator would be making that decision. So I just feel like this whole area needs to be, particularly the Class 2 and Class 3, like what does it mean to fall in that category? What criteria are we looking at? Who's making that decision and under what format? I feel like all of that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. And to Commissioner Austin's point, if we move forward with this model, which it sounds like there may be some legal questions about having these different levels of non-conforming uses, but I would have a lot of interest and want to have more discussion on how we'd operationalize that, because this body has made a lot of existing uses non-conforming and changes we've made, particularly the last 2 years. And I personally made a lot of those decisions based on knowing what their fate was going to be under the old structure. And I don't know what the fate of some of those uses might be under this new structure. And so I would really want to hear both from you, Martha, in a future presentation as this gets more flushed out, but also from the city about what's our approach? Like, if we move forward with this format, are we going to go through and categorize every existing property that has a non-conforming use and determine whether or not it's a 1 or a 2 or a 3? And are we going to do that over some timetable, or are we just going to do it as needs come up to do it? And I'd really like some clarity on that before we move forward, because this is a pretty big shift, and I'm not against it, but I don't feel like we had nearly enough information, and this is probably one of the most impactful section outside of some of the parking stuff of this entire document that we've spent time on. So that's kind of my higher level feedback. I really want this section brought back to us and with dedicated time to discuss it, because there's just too many unanswered pieces for me on this right now to be comfortable. And I don't.
And so from the city attorney's perspective, there needs to be some internal discussions on this area. As we have discovered, it's an interesting area for many reasons. It is the intersection of land use and policy, economic development. There is a fair body of law related to non-conforming uses, the continuation, the termination, the circumstances under which they are abandoned. We want to make sure that we're complying with, all of those. But how we comply with all of them has a significant policy element. And so I need to spend a lot more quality time on this than I have so far, and it needs to be done also, though, in the context of a conversation first with staff, but then ultimately with Planning Commission and Council. Because there is a significant balancing that needs to be done, and you've made some very valid points that all the things that we do in relation to non-conforming uses impact people who have current uses in operation or prospective uses. And so we have to be mindful of all of that as we're trying to wade our way through this. But there is a fair amount of conversation that still needs to be done. It's a good initial start, and I like a lot of the things that are in it, but I have some concerns about some of them, so.
Great. Well, I will look forward to this coming back to us in some format for further discussion. I will pass it down. Commissioner Liebig, do you have any additional comments on this or other parts of the?
I'm not going to beat that one up. Actually, I had the same comment as Commissioner Austin and the chair. And in addition to the fact that we've recently changed zones, which have made some uses non-compliant, legally non-compliant, this could be changed in the future. So there's implications to that as well, which are even more concerning to me. I do like the idea of the design coming back to the commission. We used to do more design way back when, and that happens. That's probably the most exciting part of what we do, rather than design the width of sidewalks and talking about policy. But anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Commissioner Harrison?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Commissioner Vu? No comment. All right, the only other comment I had was on page 37, when we're talking about, so when we're talking about pre-application review, this may be being a little nitpicky for me, but we mentioned an exemption from the Permit Streamlining Act for pre-application review, which makes total sense to me, but nowhere in this document otherwise do we mention the Permit Streamlining Act. So maybe that's just like a little bit it feels a little nonsensical. Like if we're going to reference that you're exempt from we're exempt from the Permit Streamlining Act if you're doing a pre-application review, I feel like we should call it somewhere that applications are subject to the Permit Streamlining Act otherwise.
Part of that is because the Permit Streamlining Act really applies more in the context of subdivisions than it does the things that we think of sometimes as planning actions, like use permits and variances. There's obviously a significant crossover between the zoning code and the subdivision ordinance, but we normally see Permit Streamlining Act issues come up more in the context of subdivisions.
Is that just how it's been used over the years, though, Jeff? Or, I mean, my read on the Permit Streamlining Act is that it's been meant for any development permit.
I think it lives in the Subdivision Map Act, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's exclusive to that. Honestly, it's been a while since I spent any real time with the Permit Streamlining Act, so I
know it's a little relic in state law, but it was kind of odd to me that it popped out in this one section, but wasn't really referenced anywhere else. If we don't address it, that's fine, I'll live. Any other comments or feedback from commissioners? Ms. Austin?
Last piece of feedback is I really appreciate all the public outreach you did. I think I might have specifically asked that you reach out to the chamber, and I noted in the staff report that you did that, and there was a discussion before this, so thank you very much for that outreach.
All right, Martha.
The one just final thing I wanted to mention, I know there was some wondering about what the online zoning, interactive zoning ordinance might look like. So this isn't exact because it will be customized to the features and the desires of your city, but I wanted to give a couple examples of others that Encode Plus, who will be doing that interface, has done, and that you can look at and navigate and just get a feel for the kind of idea of what would come out. So that's it. So thank you.
Thank you. That includes the end of our regular agenda. We'll move to the general administration function, part 2, informal discussion. Mr. Tilley, anything further? Any from commissioners? Ms. Austin?
Do you want to announce a new city leadership?
Yes, I would. That would be, actually, thank you for that. Recently, at least as of July 1st, Aaron Laurel has assumed our responsibilities are being our new city manager. He was formerly the Economic Development and Housing Director and been with the city for several years now. And then also Katie Jacobson was recently promoted to be the Director of Economic Development and Housing. She had been in that department for many years. So those are two very notable hires. We're excited about this new era. We will certainly miss our former city manager, Mr. Tuttle, but we're also excited about moving forward and continuing to do good things here in our community.
Well, thank you. Then I move to, I don't want to make it sound morbid, but maybe adjourn in honor of former city manager Marty Tuttle.
So be it.